Now I'd like to invite a very interesting presentation from Tajikistan. This country, actually, I'm visiting that area often myself. Actually, this afternoon I'm flying to Astana to attend the Future Energy Expo there. But I know that Tajikistan is suffering from the climate change in a very different way. It's not a hurricane, but it's melting of the icebergs on the top of the mountain. And it drastically changed the patterns of water flows, and it is impacting on hydropower and hydro management issues. It is a very serious issue, not only just Tajikistan, but also the neighboring countries are sharing the same problem in the region. So it is very interesting to hear a presentation from two panelists, Anvar Homidov, from Chief Technical Advisor, Pilot Program for Climate Resilience Secretariat, and also Craig Davies, Head of Climate Resilient Investment in EBRD, about climate resilient hydropower issue. I hope that you could manage it in view of the time constraint. 10 minutes, will it be okay? Yeah, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for you introduce my countries. You are know very well. And Tajikistan located in the continental area in Central Asia, but introduce it for my country very well. Thank you. I can start it with this presentation about for the climate resilience hydropowers. I am starting about for the climate resilience hydropower in Tajikistan. I can start about for the pilot program climate resilience. This program has the finances through the International Finance Institute, financed climate investment funds. This project has started into the 2009, and in the first phase has assisted about for the institutional agreement and the capacity needs, raising answer to climate change in the government of Tajikistan, and vulnerability assessment, enhancing the climate resilience of the Tajikistan energy sector, analysis of the sustainable land management in country, analysis of the river approach of the climate resilience for the first phase. And the second phase, prepared investment plan for the project about for the modernization of the hydrometeorological services, environmental land management and rural livelihood, building resilience in the Pyongyang River basin, and resilience of the energy section, and building capacity of the climate resilience in this country. But 2014 SCF approval project about was the Climadapt, and this project has the finances through the EBRD, and this included about for the microfinance system in countries. Now we have presented about the climate resilience and hydropower, and I can't introduce my colleague from the EBRD, Dr. Craig Davies. He will be continuing this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Anvar. Next slide, please. So I will pick up where Anvar left off. Let's talk about hydropower in Tajikistan. Hydropower is enormously important for the economy and the population of Tajikistan. Pretty much almost all of Tajikistan's electricity comes from hydropower, at least 98%. And that means that it's an invaluable resource for the entire population. It's necessary for other parts of the productive economy. It's needed for irrigation pumping. It's needed for manufacturing. which is, for example, agri-processing is very important in the country. So it's an enormously important resource for Tajikistan, and yet it's enormously sensitive to climate change. We've heard already from our chair how Tajikistan is very, very sensitive to the impacts of climate change. It's the most vulnerable country to climate change in the EBRD region. And so we have a real challenge here, that we have an enormously important sector that's fundamental for the well-being, the economic growth and the livelihoods of the people of Tajikistan, and yet it's enormously sensitive to climate change. So it's not surprising that under the context of the pilot program for climate resilience, that hydropower has been identified as a top climate resilience priority for Tajikistan. Should we move to the next slide? Okay. So in the interests of time management, I'm going to zoom right into the issue. And the topic of this session is on the use of information. So I think there are some interesting points here. Despite everything I've said about hydropower being so important for Tajikistan, there is a lack of the kind of information, a lack of the kind of data that's needed to make planning decisions in the hydropower sector in Tajikistan. You can see from the map that there's a relatively small number of hydromet stations in Tajikistan. The network is quite sparse, even though right from the days of the Soviet Union, there has been very good record keeping. There have been some serious interruptions to the collection of hydrometeorological data. So, for example, in the 1990s, Tajikistan suffered a civil war, which caused huge disruption to all kinds of public services, including the collection of hydrometeorological data. And that means that there are some big data gaps. So we have a challenge here. We don't have the luxury of waiting for perfect information. We do not have the luxury of waiting 10 or 20 years when we hopefully will have a better hydromet network, when we hopefully will have had time to collect more information and develop advanced models. We don't have that luxury because these hydropower assets are already 60 years old, built in the 1950s in the time of the Soviet Union. They're far beyond the end of their design life. We have to rehabilitate them now, because if we don't, the energy crisis is going to become even more severe. So we have a conundrum. We don't have the luxury of waiting for perfect information. We have to make decisions now that will stay with us for many decades, because these assets last for a very long time. And we have to make those decisions in an environment when we have limited information, limited data. So what are the things that we can do about that? Well, in the context of this work, some of the ways in which we worked with the Tajik authorities to address these gaps was, for example, by supporting the digitization of the data that was already available. So, for example, ever since the 1950s or even earlier, there have been very diligent paper records from all the hydromet stations in Tajikistan. Very little of it was digitized. So we had to undergo, together with the Tajik Hydromet Agency, a very intensive period of work of digitizing all of the paper records in the hydromet stations. Secondly, we also worked with the Tajik authorities, with the Tajik Hydromet Agency, also with the energy company that runs the hydropower stations, to help them learn how to use different sources of hydrometeorological information. So, for example, using satellite imagery, in developing techniques for interpreting what satellite images are telling you about, for example, how fast the snow is melting on the mountains, and then developing techniques for how that information can be fed into hydrological models so that there are better predictive tools for when the spring floods will come, informed by information about snowmelt. There are also many public access data sets available, meteorological data sets, which are available publicly. Often they're hosted by academic institutions from around the world. But again, there needs to be capacity building in countries like Tajikistan so that they can access this information and use it in their planning. So that's the first point, about very quick gallop through some of the things that we can do in order to make fundamental planning decisions about long-lived infrastructure, how we can find ways of making it more climate resilient even when we have limited data, which is a very common problem in many emerging economies and developing countries. The second point I want to make in relation to this slide is about making decisions under uncertainty, which is a topic that's come up several times today. We know that we have very high uncertainty about future climate conditions. We don't really understand, climate models tell us a lot, but they don't tell us everything, and there is always an inherent uncertainty in climate change models. So how do we make decisions under uncertainty? You can see from the bottom right-hand graph that we used the information from the climate models that we used and the hydrological models that were based on those to model how much water is expected to flow down the river that feeds this reservoir up to the 2080s. And we also modeled how that could affect energy generation. And you can see from the multiple lines on the graph that there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of variability in the possible outcomes. So we used some techniques to help us understand what is the best design of the dam that's going to give us the best energy production across those range of uncertainties. And you can see from the table on the bottom left-hand side that we used a technique where we took the three options that were on the table in terms of the design of the dam, which are the three columns, and then we calculated the net present value, which is an economic term that takes into account the future value of the asset, taking into account discounts and the expected performance of the hydropower dam. So we calculated the net present value of the asset for each design option against a range of 10 hydroclimatic scenarios. And using a min-max approach, we then selected the technical option that we reasoned would give us the best economic return across a range of hydroclimatic scenarios. Now, this is just one example of how we can make decisions, important choices like how to design a hydro dam under uncertainty. There are many, many more, but it illustrates the points that it's not an unanswerable question. There are things that we can do in order to make better decisions, even when there are high levels of uncertainty over future climate conditions. And then just very quickly, because I don't want to go over time, we'll just talk you through what was actually done in this project. So using the analytical approaches I've just described, which took about 2 years' worth of climate modeling, hydrological modeling, and then also very detailed engineering studies using all of that information, it led us to a plan for designing and upgrading this facility that included upgrading, for example, the turbines and the spillway capacities, adjusted to optimize power generation and dam safety across the whole range of climate change scenarios that we think are relevant to this location. But very importantly, it also includes a lot of capacity building and support, which is targeting both the hydropower operator and the Hydrometeorological Agency of Tajikistan, and where appropriate, the public authorities. So, for example, the Ministry of Energy and Water Resources, particularly on hydrological information, collecting it, using it for modeling, using it for decision making. And we have in this case twinned the Tajik hydropower operator with a Canadian hydropower operator, Hydro-Quebec, which is really considered to be one of the world-leading hydropower operators when it comes to understanding climate change and building climate resilience into hydropower operations. So I'll hand back to Anvar at this point. I know that we're pressed for time, but I think Anvar and I would be very happy to answer any further questions after the break.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very brief and a very interesting example. We thought about the climate resilience in many cases in terms of hurricane and typhoon and flooding, but now we hear very different cases. And it is also how they managed the lack of information to maximize the utility of the existing information. And so thank you very much. Maybe there will be many questions follow after the panel presentation.